The purpose of this video is to walk teachers through the default settings of this Google form. So you'll be prompted once you click on the link embedded in this PDF to make your own copy. And by default, you'll notice a few things. First of all, the only questions that are mandatory on this form are the student's email address and their last name, their first name, and their period. You can eliminate any of those questions if you want to. For those of you not familiar with Google Forms, you know it's a mandatory question if it's got the little red star by it. And you can very easily either delete the question or make it not required by flipping that little lever to off, and then that way the question isn't required anymore. Once the students get down to the content, the questions are no longer mandatory, and I do that because I typically use these as some kind of a homework assignment. That's kind of the beauty of the self-check option that tells the kids whether they're doing it correctly as they go, so that they know whether or not they're doing it correctly. And so I give them multiple opportunities to try it so that they can submit the assignment partially done, maybe message me over Google Classroom or something, ask me for help, and then they can come back to it. The other default settings that I have are it automatically collects email addresses and automatically sends students a receipt that shows them their responses. And that saves me a lot of headaches when kids tell me days later, oh, I know I did it, but they know to check to make sure they got that email receipt right away, so that if they didn't, we can deal with problems right then and there instead of days later when they say, they sent it, but I didn't get it. If you create your copy with your school email, you'll probably have a box that looks like that, except it obviously won't say my school district, it'll say your school district. And you check that box if you want to make mandatory that students have to log in from their school email. By default, I have that turned off. As long as my students I have contact information from something, I don't really stress about that. And then I also, by default, will set it to limit one response. I'll show you why in just a second. And under the quiz tab, I also have it set by default that they can see the questions that they missed, but they can't see the correct answers every time they submit. So I'd like to show you from the student perspective why I have them set the way that I do. So I'm going to go to preview. What the students would see. And so they'll enter their email address, that's mandatory. You'll see their instructional videos right there, directions for how to use the form that are intended for students. And again, the only thing mandatory is their contact information and name. And so question number 1, they will type into the Google form their response, and it is short answer. And the way that this Google form works is it actually tells students if they're correct as they're doing the problem. So let's say I've worked on problem number 1. I've figured out that the factored form is right here for this polynomial. I need to pay attention, and this is one thing you really need to highlight with your students to make sure that they follow the directions. I've highlighted this idea in the student video as well, because if I type in 4 and then p plus 7 and then p plus 4, or I'm sorry, minus 4, what's great about this particular Google form is that if I try to go to the next problem, it says, oh, keep trying, your brain's growing. So it is self-checking. The students can actually see whether they're getting it correct or not as they go through. But while the Google form is fantastic because it does tell them whether or not they're doing it correctly, it's also got very strict formatting issues. I have to put in one precise answer that it'll count as correct, which is why I always put in the directions something special like this. So in this particular case, they need to do, if they have two binomials, they need to put the smaller constant in first and then the larger constant in second. So as you can see, I put the positive 7, the larger constant, in first. So I need to switch it so that it becomes p minus 4 and P plus 7. Now, the fact that it switched from that red to purple and I'm allowed to move on to the next problem, that tells me that I've done it correctly. So students actually see whether or not they're getting the answers correct right as they're working on the activity, which is really great. But that's part of the reason that I don't make these questions mandatory. So let's say they keep making the mistake over and over again. The way that Google Forms work, it won't let you submit. So I'm going to try to go down and submit with that wrong answer. It won't let me submit it with a wrong answer, but it will let me submit with a blank. So what my students will do frequently, if they're getting an answer incorrect, they'll go ahead and submit with that answer blank, email me, message me, and say, hey, I'm having a really hard time with number 5. I give them a clue, we talk it out, whatever, and then they can go back to edit their response with the correct question. So that is why the short answer questions are not mandatory.